Let us answer more questions related to the elections, but this time it more relates to voters' registration. But first, the usual disclaimer. Please read along. And so the nagging question has always been, where is my voter's ID? Before, the COMELEC issues a voter's ID to those whose application for registration is approved by the Election Registration Board. But today, the COMELEC does not anymore issue a voter's ID in deference to the national ID law. It incorporates all government-issued IDs into one unified ID. So if there is no more voter's ID, can I still vote on election day? Yes, you can, because a voter's ID or any other valid ID for that matter is not required for you to be able to cast your vote. How do we establish the identity of the voter then? There is a document called Election Day Certified Voters List, or EDCVL, where the name, photograph, and signature of the voter appear. So for example, you get inside the polling place on election day. Offer to vote, the electoral board is going to verify your identity by referring to the EDCVL where your name, photograph, and signature appear. In case of doubt, that's when the electoral board requires you to present a valid ID and not necessarily a voter's ID. The other instance where a valid ID and not necessarily a voter's ID may be required is when a watcher challenges your right to vote on the ground that you're not the person you claim to be. In other words, he suspects your identity. And so for you to be able to establish your identity, you must present a valid ID and not necessarily a voter's ID. But of course, if you were issued a voter's ID way back then, you can still use that to establish your identity on election day in case of doubt or in case of challenge against your right to vote. The other nagging question is, are there flying voters in the Philippines? And by flying voters, you mean that the COMELEC allows a person to register in a city or municipality where he is not a resident of. But before we answer that, we need to know who are qualified to register as a voter in the Philippines and who are not qualified. The qualifications are age, citizenship, and residence. The disqualifications could be your criminal record or soundness of mind. Let's talk about them one by one. Insofar as age is concerned, the law requires that you be at least 18 years old on the day of elections. So question, if I'm 17 today, can I register as a voter? The answer is yes, provided that on election day, you turn 18 as required by law. In other words, if you're underage today, you can still register provided that on election day, you turn 18 because that is the reckoning period for age qualification and not the day of registration. What about citizenship? May a dual citizen register as a voter in the Philippines? Normally, if you're a dual citizen or reside abroad, you should avail of the overseas absentee voting. But if you're a dual citizen who reside in the Philippines at least 1 year before the day of election, and in the city or municipality where you propose to vote at least 6 months prior to the day of elections, then you can still register as a voter even if you're a dual citizen. And you should not be otherwise disqualified by law. So who are the people disqualified by law to register? They are those who are convicted to suffer imprisonment of not less than 1 year, or those convicted of a crime of disloyalty, or a crime against national security of the country. What are these crimes? These are sedition, rebellion, and even violation of firearms law. But please take note in the first instance where it says, convicted to suffer imprisonment for not less than 1 year, it does not anymore talk about the nature of the criminal offense. What it talks about is actually the length of term of sentence, that it must be at least 1 year. In the second sentence, it now qualifies as to the nature of the criminal offense. It must pertain to disloyalty or against national security regardless of the length of the term of sentence. But in both instances, we require finality of conviction. Because, for example, you were convicted in the first instance, but that conviction is under appeal, you can still register as a voter pursuant to your right to presumption of innocence. And the other disqualification is if you're insane or incompetent, provided such insanity, such incompetence is declared by a competent authority who is a government doctor that certifies that this person is insane or incompetent. And finally, let's talk about residence because this is the bottom line that unlocks the mystery of whether or not indeed there are flying voters in the Philippines. Let's read the language of the law, which is also actually the language of the Constitution. It says you must be a resident of the Philippines for at least 1 year and in the place where you propose to vote for at least 6 months before election day. Take note, it says before election day. It does not say before registration day. In other words, if today I propose to vote in a particular city or municipality, even if I'm not yet a resident there, can I register? Yes, I can, because the 6-month period requirement is not reckoned towards the date of registration, but towards the date of election. In other words, even if I'm not yet a resident in this particular city or municipality, I can apply to register here, provided I reside in this city or municipality 6 months prior to the day of the elections. So now, if people say the COMELEC allows applicants to register even if not residents there, that is actually nothing but a winged myth because that is not how the law defines it to be. The law requires that you be a resident of that particular city or municipality where you propose to vote 6 months prior to the date of election and not 6 months prior to the date of registration. And so, if that particular person applied for registration, can that application for registration be opposed? Yes. You can actually go to the Election Registration Board to oppose the application of a person suspected to be a non-resident of that city or municipality. And that is going to be an administrative proceedings. However, what if the ERB says this person can still be allowed to register here as a voter? Do you have a remedy? Yes, and that remedy is what is known as inclusion or exclusion proceedings before the municipal trial court, and it now becomes a judicial proceedings. So when do I petition for exclusion? It can be done anytime except 100 days before election day. Who can petition? It could either be any registered voter, representative of a political party, or the election officer himself or herself can petition the court, tell the court, exclude this person from the voters list because he lacks one or two or all the necessary qualifications to register as a voter. What about inclusion? Inclusion can be done anytime except 105 days before election day. Who can petition to include? Of course, no one else except the voter. If the voter's name was deleted, if his application for registration was disapproved with the Election Registration Board, he can go to court and say, I petition to be included in the voters list because I am qualified to register here as a voter. And so now, if the MTC or the Municipal Trial Court decides that this particular voter should be allowed to vote in the city or municipality, there is still a remedy for those who are aggrieved. They can go to the Regional Trial Court to petition or question the decision of the Municipal Trial Court. But what if the Regional Trial Court says, we affirm the decision of the MTC, we allow this person to be a voter in the city or municipality? Can there still be a remedy? Ordinarily, there is no more remedy because the decision of the RTC is going to be final and executory. In fact, a motion for reconsideration is a prohibited pleading. However, in case there is grave abuse of discretion amounting to lack or excessive jurisdiction, the decision of the RTC can still be corrected by certiorari filed before the higher court, otherwise known as the Court of Appeals. That being said, an informed electorate is essential in a democracy. Thank you and Merry Christmas.